So today's lecture is going to be on segregation, so we're still in Unit 4 and 5, so it's still smushed together. We're on Lecture 6, and we're just going to be hitting Unit 5, questions 19 and 20, and the philosophies chart directly below them. So not a lot of questions, but these are really important issues that are affecting the U.S. at this time. So first off, lives of African Americans. So we've been talking about a lot of new immigrants coming into the U.S., mainly from Southern and Eastern Europe. So the Italian population is really booming in the U.S. at this time, and also the Jewish population is growing. But there's also a large group of African Americans moving to new areas in the country. So this is what this Great Migration refers to. It's over 1 million African Americans moving from the rural South to areas in the Midwest and the Northeast. So they're seeking opportunity in more industrialized areas. Why? So that's a big question for number 19. So why are they doing this? Well, number one, so the current status in the South is still incredibly poor. So it's about the same as it was 20 or 30 years ago after the Civil War. So there's still Jim Crow laws on the books. Racism is blatant. And generally, and another big thing was just the South's economy was very stagnant. So there wasn't a lot of new jobs being produced. Not a very industrialized area still. So it was incredibly difficult for African Americans to make a living in sort of factories and other methods other than farming or sharecropping and things of that nature. Another reason for it, so for still number 19, another reason would be the jobs available in the Northeast and the Midwest. So these are industrializing cities. They're producing a lot of jobs. They need a lot of people to fill these, and factory owners would be accommodating and hiring African Americans. So African Americans are moving for these opportunities to better themselves, better their families, and just gain an amount of money that can sort of feed themselves and not have to depend on farming or other older forms of labor. So, and also this picture down here in the right-hand corner is African Americans protesting. It says slavery was abolished, but they're still sort of in the same state. It's still unfair. They don't have any civil liberties. Jim Crow laws are really affecting them, and that's what we're going to talk about with number 20. So we talked about Jim Crow laws before, how they helped start segregation, and they really affected African Americans very negatively. We're going to go into a little more detail today. So Jim Crow, so if you've never heard this story, Jim Crow is a character this comedian played at this time in the South. So it was a white guy who dressed up in blackface, and sort of went on stage and sort of tried to act like a fool and sort of make fun of African Americans. A very racist comedian, and tried to make people laugh, and that to sort of a crude sense of humor. But that's what these laws were named after, because they were intentionally targeted towards African Americans and were intentionally very prejudiced in their reasons for making them. So what was the purpose of them? Is to keep segregation going. So we're talking about public schools, we're talking about any kind of public place, transportation, restrooms, restaurants, any kind of things like that. So what are some examples of these laws? So directly below that, we're going to hit on those. So it kept African Americans from voting. So that's a huge issue with one of these examples, and these three to the side are examples of Jim Crow laws. So they're stopping African Americans from voting. For one way is literacy tests. So this idea is you have to be able to read to vote, which, I mean, could make a lot of sense to some people. The problem was that the rules weren't really enforced evenly across the board. So if a white male couldn't vote or couldn't pass this literacy test, sometimes they were sort of passed through or they weren't even given the test. But African Americans were sort of held to this standard at a greater level, and there's even sort of comedic stories about how they'd give very educated African Americans who could easily pass any kind of literacy test for any individual, white, black, any kind of race or ethnicity. And they'd give them these incredibly hard passages to read and interpret, and basically they could just say they were wrong and sort of get them to not be able to vote. The idea was if you could stop African Americans from voting, you could stop African Americans from getting into office or people who have their best interests at heart. So white males could keep control in the South who were in favor of these Jim Crow laws. So the second one was poll taxes. So below there, so this is having to pay a tax to vote. So this was a problem, obviously, for many African Americans because they did not have the opportunity to really make a great income. So it was very hard for them to pay these poll taxes. And the grandfather clause is the last one, which is one of the most blatantly racist ones. It's basically if your grandfather could vote, then you are allowed to vote automatically. So this is a way for a lot of white males to get around the literacy test because the grandfather clause sort of superseded that one. So if their grandfather could vote, they could pass through all this other stuff. But the problem was a lot of the grandfathers of African Americans in the South did not have the right to vote or were slaves. So this was a blatant way of keeping African Americans away from the voting booths at this time. So now we're going to go. So here's an example of Jim Crow law sort of in a picture form. So this is obviously the white folks' car in the train here, and then the Jim Crow car. So basically giving African Americans the shaft, not letting them have the same opportunities as white Americans. And then this would be a sign that you could see on windows at this time. So we cater to white trade only. So basically being blatantly obvious that they do not want African Americans in their store or want their business at all. So now we're going to move on to two big guys to know in the African American community during this time. So the first one is Booker T. Washington. So he was born a slave. He was a he was a wheeler and a dealer. He liked to make deals. He was a gradualist, which means he wanted a little bit at a time. He wasn't big on a radical change. So his philosophy was accommodation. So he was basically saying at the beginning to sort of, okay, we'll accept that whites have more power than us, but you have to meet us in the middle here and give us some education, some vocational training, ways of helping us. So he was about getting little by little from the white community, white people in office, because his idea was rebellion only increases discrimination. So if we do this radical change, then maybe it actually makes it worse for us. And he also believed that hard work and useful education would push people to the top. So help African Americans, not necessarily push them to the top, but help them sort of rise up in their current status. So in a way, he's sort of giving up this idea at first of the chance of equality or voting rights. So he's like, okay, you can keep complete civil equality and voting rights. We understand that we're not going to get all this at one time, but we're going to start chipping away. We want more education. We want vocational training. We want things just a little bit at a time. So public reaction to this, the public favorite. So obviously, white people would definitely favor his views over other more radical views like Du Bois, who we'll go into soon. So white individuals were, this sounds like a good plan. We'll give them a little bit. Maybe that'll pacify them and sort of shut them up for a little bit. But with African Americans, Southern blacks had a little more favor for it just because they were in such a situation where they didn't have many opportunities at all, or many opportunities. So they liked it a little more because it did give them some benefits from white Americans. Northern African Americans, though, really didn't like the plan because they had more opportunity. They wanted more civil rights. They wanted to be considered closer to equals. So the impact. So one thing he did start was the Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University in Alabama, which is a nationally recognized university, mainly an African American school that is meant to help. It was initially meant for this vocational training that he really wanted to push for. And you also, after his impact, could also be you see a higher number of African Americans going to higher education or getting vocational training. So he was pushing this idea of vocational training. So now we're going to move on to Du Bois. So a completely different guy than Booker T. Washington. So Washington was born a slave. Du Bois was born a free man. He was the first African American graduate to graduate from Harvard with a PhD, so a huge accomplishment there. His philosophy, he wanted civil rights. He wanted voting rights. But he wants things more immediately. So he wants African Americans to become economically independent from white Americans, to not depend on whites for jobs, for other things like that. And also he wanted to reform education for African Americans. So he saw that education was sort of set up for African Americans to fail, for whites to succeed, and he wanted to change that. He also had this really different idea about how the elite African American community, he called it the talented 10th, should be really lifted up in the community and pushed into office, because he thought if we could get these talented 10th, these top 10% of African Americans who are highly educated, highly motivated, this gives African Americans leaders to look up to and really progress things going on in the country. So public reaction to his views, he was seen as more of a radical, and obviously he scared a lot of white individuals who had power at this time. And he wasn't as well liked, but he is admired a lot more today for his actions. So Impact, he's Niagara Movement and NAACP. So Niagara Movement was sort of the beginnings of the NAACP. So his impact would be seen even today with that organization and the advancement of, in his eyes, colored people. So he wasn't just about African Americans. He even was pushing for Asian Americans and others to get more rights too. So that is all for today, and